Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mailbox. We haven't done one of these in a while, have we? And there's a ton of questions that have been lying around in threads and email boxes that haven't been answered, so perhaps we should do this a little bit more regularly. My name is TotalBiscuit, and I'm going to be rounding up a few of the user questions gathered from various places. We have a nice big stockpile right now, and be opening up a place for you to leave your own questions in the next couple of weeks, so just keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, there are plenty of questions that have yet to be answered, and we need to get those out of the way first. Game in the background is a little bit of Titanfall 2 multiplayer. Let's get right on with the first question. What happened to port reports? Will they ever return to the channel? Well, this is a bit of an interesting one because the format itself was becoming somewhat out of control. Originally, when we started doing port reports, it was just a case of just look at it on my machine, look at the options, see what's going on with that. And I think the options overview in particular can be very helpful, especially when dealing with universal issues, such as, say, negative mouse acceleration, all that kind of thing. The problem comes when you start to talk performance, because when you start to talk performance, you have to take into account that there are so very many PC configurations, and most of them are not like yours, which means that your performance indicator is only of limited value. This has become especially true over the last couple of years when we've seen incredibly inconsistent performance that hasn't made logical sense. It's not a case of, oh, well, I have a powerful machine, so this game that otherwise runs bad runs relatively well for me, and that there's sort of a linear, logical, rational scaling going on right there. That's not true. What we've seen is massive inconsistency across setups for a reason which is not so obvious, not simply down to raw power. And there's where the problems start to really come in, because you start to get people turning around and saying, you're wrong, your performance isn't exactly indicative of anything, or there's something wrong with your PC, trying to sort of invalidate all of your results. And of course, the way that you try and deal with that is expand the number of PCs you use. But even then, even if you try out 3 or 4 different PCs, that doesn't really matter. It could very well perform very differently on anybody else's, regardless of how many PCs you try, not to mention the fact that vastly increases the amount of time that has to be spent on it. And really, this is not a hardware channel. It never has been a hardware channel. You certainly shouldn't treat it as one. And as a direct result, the format became bloated, it started to take too much time, and it wasn't helping people. It was just resulting in people turning around and saying, well, this isn't true. There's quite a few issues with covering PC performance, not least of which the fact that there are so many tribalistic people that become almost emotionally, in fact not almost, definitely emotionally attached to a product and will defend it come hell or high water. Space Hulk is a prime example of this. What we had yesterday on the stream was play a little bit of the Space Hulk beta. It didn't perform well. I mean, it was capped at 60 FPS, but it was frequently dropping down to 40, only on high, well, not even maximum detail. And we had hard crashes, as well as some pretty dodgy mouse performance and UI problems. Now, most of these, you can say, these are pretty objective. They're not stuff that you can really debate, but people will try and do it anyway. The Warhammer 40,000 fan base is, like many fan bases, in certain respects quite rabid, and the response to even saying on stream that the game didn't run well was a torrent of insults and claims that it was a lie, and that because somebody else had run it fine, that meant that the machine was the problem, as opposed to the actual game. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that when, again, it's on a brand new professionally built machine, but the main point is not to highlight that people are dickheads and act like idiots. We already knew that. That's not helpful. The thing is that you get onto the aspect of anecdotal evidence, and when it comes to PC performance, saying that pretty much every piece of performance evidence is anecdotal one way or the other. And as a direct result of that, it's difficult to assess whether or not problems are widespread and systemic, or whether or not problems are isolated. This, I think, is the biggest problem that PC currently has. This may very well be something that Steam could be used to potentially solve, particularly considering it has a lot of information about people's hardware, and there's a direct link to the API that can actually pull that info, and could be used maybe by a third-party site, or even by Valve themselves, to catalog how many people are having performance problems and how many people are not. You can go, of course, look at the Steam reviews, but again, you're looking at anecdotal data, and you run into the same problem, where you say, well, is it that person's PC? I don't know, because I don't know what their hardware is. Most people don't state that, which makes their anecdotal evidence effectively useless. And even then, they may be lying. They may not necessarily be telling the truth. That data isn't objectively gathered, and it's not reviewed in such a way that can authenticate its accuracy. Even if you could, you're still in the same position where it just might be some weird bugbear that's very, very hard to identify. What PC needs right now, as far as I'm concerned, is almost an aggregate whereby you can get a large amount of data on people's performance and aggregate it into one place, making it fairly easy to understand the extent of performance problems. You could tie those performance into some sort of benchmark, you could tie them into the hardware gathered information, DXDiag, and all that sort of thing, and with enough numbers, you could get over the margin of error that would come from false reports and dodgy stuff like that. If even a few % of people on PC are having problems, that could necessarily represent tens, even hundreds of thousands of people. And it could indicate that the game does have serious issues. Over the last few years, we've encountered a great number of games that have run into this. Dishonored 2 is a very recent one. The Space Hulk beta is something that quite literally happened yesterday. But we look at things like Arkham Knight, we look at things like No Man's Sky, and even in those situations where it was fairly abundantly clear that the games had problems, there were still people shouting from the rooftops that they didn't. Either because the good old phrase, "it works fine for me," or simply because they were defending the game for God knows what ridiculous reason, tribalism, fanboyism, Lord knows what. There's also the aspect that many people are really bad at assessing performance. They don't do so either on an objective level or with anything that constitutes real data. They do it based on feeling, personal standards, and more often than not, they don't even explain what those personal standards are. Some people are okay with 30, some people are okay with 60, some people won't be happy until 120. You know, that's an issue in and of itself. We see people debating frame rate when there is no debate to be had. We know that higher frame rate is objectively better in all circumstances, to a greater or lesser extent, but people will still argue otherwise because feelings or whatever. So I don't think port report really helps, honestly. I think that it's still better to be cautious. I don't think that it is necessarily a bad thing that I could go on a stream, say that a game doesn't run very well. That doesn't really do harm, especially considering it's a pre-release version and people shouldn't be pre-ordering video games in the first place. But when it comes to release stuff, even if you put out a report and even if you spent a lot of time on it, use multiple machines, which I have in the past, it may very well still not represent everybody's experiences. So my recommendation to people would, of course, be cautious, stop pre-ordering video games, but also to keep a close eye on forums in particular, because if you do see a lot of threads popping up with issues, especially when it comes to people that actually do provide the system information and more detailed descriptions of the problem, then it's generally best to pay attention to them, even if they seem like a minority, than pay attention to the people that are not having issues. It is very much better to err on the side of caution as a consumer rather than taking the risk, even if Steam does offer a fairly robust refund policy. Bear in mind that those refunds are very much still at the whim of Steam. They can very easily turn around and refuse you a refund for any reason. And it is only 2 hours. It's very easy to go over that limit. You spend a couple of hours tweaking, trying to figure things out, and suddenly you realize you can't refund anymore. So it's damn right there was a risk. In an ideal world, demos would be available for everything, benchmarking tools would be available for everything, but they're not. So it is best to err on the side of caution when it comes to potentially poor performance and optimization. But we do need something. We do need some sort of aggregate source for this kind of thing, because it is not going away, and one could argue that the problem is even becoming worse over time. Question here, what game series do you think should be given more credit than it currently does? Well, this certainly sounds a little bit contrarian, but I would, to some extent, say Call of Duty. I think that the overall reaction and bias from a certain portion of the player base when it comes to Call of Duty is excessive and fairly inaccurate to some extent. I have to admit that this does feel a little foolish after Infinite Warfare, considering that the multiplayer for that has absolutely not changed. and that's, in my opinion, a big black mark on the product. However, you've got to bear in mind that the series is being developed by 3 separate studios that all have 3 very different ideas on an otherwise very popular formula, and that has actually shone through in the last few games. We've seen Black Ops 3's campaign that was built from the ground up for co-op, could be played in any order, and also had an emphasis on powers, spells basically, cyber powers, which is a big departure for the Call of Duty series, which was otherwise, for the most part, just run and gun shooty. We also had Advanced Warfare that had a much bigger emphasis in the single player on verticality and freedom of movement, and the multiplayer's movement system was a drastic departure from previous games, to the point where a lot of console gamers complained that it was too hard to use. So this is what happens, I guess, when you try and innovate a franchise that the player base doesn't seem to actually want changed all that much. Prior to that, of course, we had Black Ops 2, which had RTS elements in the game. There were several Strike Force levels that allowed you to play an RTS-style game mode. There were elements of the campaign that would change based on your actions, which, again, is not very common. That's kind of a new thing for Call of Duty. And the Zombies mode has changed quite significantly over the course of a number of games as well. For an annual franchise, I would say that COD, with the exception perhaps of Infinite Warfare, although you can still argue that the single player has pushed some fairly large innovations, including, of course, the addition of a full-on flight system for an upgradable space fighter, which is a pretty large departure for the series, has in fact innovated far more than people seem to claim. And I think that COD gets hit for things that Battlefield is very guilty of, and yet Battlefield gets away scot-free with it. Poor campaigns, very similar multiplayer, tacked on theme. Those are big issues, in my opinion, with Battlefield, and that's been the case really for the last 4 or 5 games, and it seems to get away with it. I actually have a degree of sympathy for Call of Duty development because the series is in a very tough spot. You've got a franchise that makes money hand over fist by making something that people clearly want, and of course the age-old adage of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, does tend to apply. That said, when you do try and make changes, you can get full-on revolts from your annual player base. This is especially true bearing in mind that PC gamers and console gamers do tend to desire somewhat different things when it comes to first-person shooters, whereas Call of Duty fans on console may have reviled the system in Advanced Warfare for movement because use of it on a controller was tricky. PC gamers seem to enjoy it a lot more. COD has a strong core formula that clearly appeals to a very large demographic. The sales of the current edition do seem to be flagging. One has to wonder if that's got anything to do with the fairly massive negative PR reaction to the title, which really came out of nowhere. I was kind of surprised by that. I guess it was just a boiling over point for people. And really, it was, in my opinion, quite tribalistic. We had people mass downvoting the trailer for really no reason. The trailer didn't show anything that was worthy of that. And yet, on the other side, just fawning all over the Battlefield 1 trailer. And of course, as Battlefield 1 comes out, we discover it has a poor campaign and that the multiplayer is the same as it's been for the last 4 or 5 games, just with a slightly different set of guns. So one has to wonder if that really deserved all of its adoration. But I think that as a series gets something of a bad rap, and it's kind of in a rock and a hard place situation. Change too much, potentially alienate your core year-on-year franchise-buying fan base, and these are guys that are buying not only the edition of the game that comes out on launch, but often also the season pass. So you're looking at $120 basket purchases as opposed to $60. And of course, we even have those weapon-based microtransactions that are starting to creep in as well, which are not necessarily a good thing. I do wonder if Infinite Warfare will be a watershed moment for the franchise. I do wonder if the popularity of Overwatch will have a significant effect on the Call of Duty development over the next few years. Bearing in mind it is a three-studio rotation, COD can take a little while to adapt to trends. We already have seen some hero and class-based elements in Call of Duty. Black Ops 3 and Infinite Warfare both have hero class-based powers, and I imagine that's probably going to continue to be expanded as it's been proven through the popularity of Overwatch and, of course, Dota-style games that people do seem to like that kind of thing. But a mass innovation when it comes to Call of Duty is very, very difficult to do. There are plenty of valid things to rag on Call of Duty for, no doubt about that, not least of which problems with PC, lack of proper dedicated servers, modding support lagging behind in a major way, although one has to say that Black Ops 3 mod support has finally kicked in and certainly is offering a lot more choice than Battlefield has over the last few games. But I think that COD does get a bit of an unfair rap. You know, it is a series that is cool to hate, as it were, and has perhaps come to represent a type of gamer that the more self-aggrandizing hardcore gamers seem to despise. This notion of a dude, bro, jock, college gamer that's too casual to know what the best thing is, when in reality, of course, that's all incredibly subjective, and it's highly elitist to suggest that there's only one way to game right. Okay, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. There will hopefully be more regular episodes of this over the next few weeks in accompaniment to the more substantive content. If you like this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there, and I'll see you next time.